Getting wealthy requires being an optimist. You have to be optimistic about yourself and your own abilities. You have to be optimistic about the economy. You have to be optimistic about your industry. And staying rich is almost the exact opposite.
That's Morgan Housel, New York Times bestselling author of The Psychology of Money, timeless lessons on wealth, greed, and happiness.
I think the best framework is save your money like a pessimist and invest your money like an optimist. Save with the idea that the world is fragile and my industry is flawed. And there's going to be wars and recessions and pandemics, and I need to save my money for that fragile, uncertain future. But then invest your money with the idea that if you can endure all of that, the rewards for those who stick around can be incredible.
I'm Michael Mogill, founder and CEO of CRISP, the nation's #1 law firm growth company. I've built my business through practice, not theory. CRISP started with just $500 to my name and has grown to over 8 figures in revenue over the last few years, earning a spot on the Inc. 500 list of the fastest growing private companies in America. Our approach has been to take everything we've learned about generating massive growth within our own organization and help the country's most ambitious and committed law firm owners do the same for theirs. In each episode of this podcast, I sit down with innovative market leaders from the legal industry and beyond to learn from those who thrive in the face of adversity, challenge the status quo, and define what it means to be a true game changer. I sat down with Morgan Housel to discuss why luck and risk often can be more financially consequential than skills and effort alone, why getting wealthy and staying wealthy are 2 entirely different skill sets, and how to prepare for things you can't see coming.
The level of cash that I think most people should have should feel like it's too much. If it feels like it's excessive, then you at least have a fighting chance to deal with the risks you cannot even envision.
That's coming up on the Game Changing Attorney podcast. Before we begin today's episode, I want to remind you that we aren't beholden to any sponsors or run any ads on this podcast. This allows us to present all of our episodes raw and unfiltered. I'm not going to push any made-to-order meal services on you or try to save you any money on your car insurance. That being said, I have one small request. If you receive any value from this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. Pay the fee so we can keep this podcast free. All right, Morgan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael.
So you're a New York Times bestselling author. Your books have sold millions and millions of copies. They've been translated into more than 50 languages. You're also a partner at the Collaborative Fund. I want to talk today about your best-selling book, The Psychology of Money. And just really to, I know it's been a number of years since this book has come out, but what compelled you to write it in the first place?
Well, I've been a financial writer for my entire career, ever since before I graduated college. And so I spent many years, a decade and a half, writing about investing and money from the behavioral standpoint. I've never been interested in what stock should you buy? Where's the economy going? When's the next market crash? I've never been interested in it. And frankly, I don't think many people can do that, make those forecasts accurately. But I thought the psychology of investing and money was so fascinating, of just what's going through your head when you're making decisions with spending money, with investing money, with saving money. That was endlessly fascinating to me. And that was something where I felt if you look throughout history, it's been the same over time. It's been stable over time. How people respond to greed and fear is the same today that it was 100 years ago. So relative to the people who are making market forecasts, and they were wrong after wrong after wrong after wrong, the people who understood the psychology of money, I think had a much better understanding of what the future held for us. And so not only was it more interesting, I think it got you closer to the truth of coming up with a philosophy for money, for how to use money as a tool to live a better life, but also for understanding how this giant machine we call the global economy works.
Yeah. This is a topic in particular, whenever you're discussing money, sometimes it's, some people see it as taboo, others, it makes them uncomfortable. And you state that the reason why we don't always do what we're supposed to do when it comes to money is that we're relatively new to the game and that we all view and think about money differently. Can you speak to that?
Well, it wasn't that long ago, our grandparents' generation, where the vast majority of Americans worked until the day they died. There was no such thing as retirement. And even if you suggested that, certainly to an average worker in the 1940s or 50s, they would have said, retirement? What? No, I can't afford to do that. And then that really shifted in a profound way over the last 30 or 40 years ago. Basically, our parents' generation, and certainly our generation, are the first generation in American history where the vast majority of workers expect to retire and have maybe several decades of not working, but needing to fund their lifestyle, of course. And so this is a very new concept, this idea of retirement. And when we have to do it on our own, we have to save on our own in our 401ks and our IRAs. And since it's so new, there just has not been any generational knowledge transfer of how to do it right. Most things in life, like how to drive a car, how to tie your shoes, whatever it might be, you learn from your parents learn from their parents. There's generational knowledge transfer of how this works. With money, there hasn't been that yet. So we should not be surprised that people are so bad at it. It's brand new. The 401k and the IRA and the Roth IRA, those things are one generation old. And during that one generation, we've had, 4 recessions. And so there's just not a lot of experience doing it. So that to me leads me to have a little bit more empathy for people who really screw it up. And for people who haven't saved enough for retirement, don't know how to do it, are making mistakes left and right. It's like, look, it's not necessarily totally excusable, but I understand why it happens. This is a brand new thing we're trying to figure out.
And it seems like our personal experiences, really with anything, including money, define how we think about things. So it's like our personal experiences with money. If we haven't had a great experience, then we may believe that, money's the root of all evil, or it's something that's unattainable. What are your thoughts on this?
There's a great quote from my brother-in-law, who's a social worker, and he works with kids who are very disadvantaged in life. And he says in social work, they have a saying, which is, all behavior makes sense with enough information. So in his profession, if you look at a child who is misbehaving at school, not going to school, getting into fights, doing drugs, it's easy to just criticize and chastise that child, and maybe sometimes you should. But he says all behavior makes sense with enough information. If you see what that child is very likely dealing with at home, the instability of their home, the lack of love from their parents, abuse, whatever it might be, their behavior starts to make more sense. You don't excuse it, but you're like, I understand why you would react the way that you did. And I think that philosophy extends to a lot of areas in life, including money. And you mentioned earlier that psychology of money has been translated into 50 different languages. One thing that happens in that scenario is I get all this feedback from people around the world saying, what you wrote, Morgan, is accurate for Americans, but it's not accurate for me in Thailand or Cambodia or China or Russia, whatever it might be, because there are things that you and I, and maybe most people listening to this, take for granted about how the US stock market works, how the US economy works, or even different social aspirations. How much do I want to make money? How much is being rich important to me and this culture? Well, that might be very different from what it is in the Netherlands or in South Africa, whatever it might be. And so whenever you see people acting a certain way, I think it's easy to overlook how much their personal experiences of the dumb luck of where and when they were born influence those experiences. And so we want to treat money like it's a science. We try to treat it like it's a science. And in science, there is one right answer for everyone. Gravity works the same here as it does in China, But with money, it's just not like that. It is such a cultural phenomenon and an individual experience phenomenon. I heard the saying recently of someone who is very wealthy now, but grew up very, very poor. And she said that she had what she called post-traumatic Baroque syndrome.
Yeah.
Even though she was wealthy today, she could not bring herself to spend money because she's so traumatized and emotionally scarred from being poor and is so paranoid about going back to that scenario. And so all of us have a little bit of that in us where we are so influenced by our past experiences that we think we are acting in the only way that makes sense to act today, like the rational way to spend money. But this is all a very unique individual approach.
And you mentioned luck. I want to talk about this. Years ago, a mentor of mine who built a $1 billion business, he told me, he said, Michael, life is luck. And I challenged him at the time. I was like, well, what do you mean? What about free will and working hard? And you state that, we tend to overemphasize hard work and, what our outcomes are sometimes more influenced by luck. But I'm curious, how can the accidental impact of actions outside of our control sometimes be more consequential than the ones that we consciously take?
And this can rankle a lot of people because when you look at a successful person and say, well, there was luck involved there, it makes you or me, the person saying that, it makes them look bitter and jealous. And also, if I look in the mirror and I say, Morgan, you just got lucky, I got lucky, I don't want to accept that either. That makes me feel diminished for the hard work that I've put in. So people tend to, it's very easy to overlook and sweep luck under the rug. But of course it plays a role. Now, it's very common. I didn't write this in the book, but I hear it all the time recently. When people talk about luck, they say, well, the harder I work, the luckier I get, or some version of that saying. And that, I think, is just a bad definition of luck. If you can do something that increases your chances of becoming quote unquote lucky, then it's not luck, it's skill. Luck, in my view, by and large, is where, when, and to whom you were born. What generation were you born into? What country? And who are your parents? You have no control over that. Doesn't matter how hard you work or how smart you are, you have no control over those things. And we should not pretend that if Bill Gates or Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg were born in Zimbabwe in 1750, that they would have had the same success that they had today. Of course it plays a role. Now, does that mean that Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and those people are not brilliant, hardworking? No, of course they are. They're the most brilliant, hardworking people of their generation, maybe of modern times. But we shouldn't overlook what different elements of luck played a role in. In the book, I use the example of Bill Gates, who, genius, hardworking, yes, checks all those boxes, also went to the only high school in America that had a computer. That was out of his control. His parents just told him to go to that school, and it happened, and it's set up. And by his own words, he said, if there were no Lakeside, which is the high school he went to, there would be no Microsoft. Why this is so important? It's not just to look and sound a little bit bitter. It's important when you are looking up to these people as role models to say, what of their traits can I emulate? What of their traits can I try to implement in my own life? And when you look at Warren Buffett, maybe you can implement his longevity or his endurance, his long-term time horizon. When you look at Bill Gates, you can try to emulate his work ethic, but you cannot emulate the luck that they had in their life. And so it's just very important when you're trying to figure out what to copy and who to mimic, that you're picking out things that are something in life that are repeatable.
So when someone hears that, for example, I mean, just their perspective might be, well, okay, well, I wasn't born lucky, right? Or I wasn't born to these parents with this type of opportunity. In some ways, I think they can almost place limits on what they're capable of achieving. Like, would you argue against that, though?
Yes, I mean, it's certainly the case that some people are born at third base, and some people are born out in the parking lot struggling to get into the ball field. Of course, that's the case. That's always been the case. Elon Musk is a really interesting example of, from my understanding, his parents were reasonably well off, but he grew up in South Africa and had a very, very difficult childhood. You compare that to some other people who are very successful who had absolutely glorious childhoods. So of course, there's a different element to it. One thing that is interesting about what I just said is the idea that the harder your upbringing, the more kind of grizzled and determined and chip on your shoulder you're going to be. That's going to get you there. So I think there's two kinds of benefits to being born. One is you're just born on third and a half base, sliding into home, and you have that benefit. The other is you're born in some sort of not catastrophic, but reasonable poverty that just drives and motivates you, and you're just going to outwork everyone from there. So I think it's two of those. The hard thing is people who are born into such poverty or to such violence, whatever it might be, that they are unable to overcome the situation that they were born into, and it holds them in that spot. You don't have a generational wealth growth from there. That's the tragedy and the trauma is when people just can't escape it because it's so deep what they were born into, or the values that were instilled in them and their parents prevent them from wanting to work hard, go to college, get a good job, start a business, whatever it might be.
Yeah. And it's like, and your other points, like sometimes the adversities become strengths. And curious about, I know in the book you mentioned that, there's countless rich individuals who've lost everything because they felt that the millions they had were not enough, and that we shouldn't risk what we have and need for what we don't have and don't need. But, a lot of us are always shifting the goalpost, right? I see this with business leaders, probably a lot of people listening to this podcast. They dreamed of having a $1 million business. And as soon as they got to $1 million, then they said, okay, now I want a $2 million business, then a $10 million business. And I'm curious as to, why many of us are constantly shifting the goalpost, and when is enough enough?
I think what's true is that there is no such thing as an objective measure of wealth. There's no such thing as once you have X dollars, then you're wealthy. That has never and will never exist, because all wealth is just relative to somebody else. It's just, what do I have relative to that guy? What do I have relative to her house? That's all it is. It's just relative to other people. So we're fortunate. It is a great thing that we live in a world that tends to, most of the time, get wealthier and more productive and better technologies, better health. That tends to be the case. Well, because of that, it automatically pushes people into have a shifting goalpost, because it's easy today to say, once I have $1 million, $10 million, whatever it is, then I'll be happy. And then you get to that level, but then you just start comparing yourself to people who have $2 million or $20 million, and you just keep going down. One extreme example of this that I used in the book are professional athletes, where the minimum wage in Major League Baseball is, I think, around $750,000. It's in that zone. That's the minimum wage for a player in the MLB. By any metric, that is wealthy. If you compare that to the rest of the nation, or certainly the rest of the world, that is like unbelievable success. You are so wealthy. I guarantee you not a single MLB player making the minimum wage feels wealthy, because they're on a team with somebody who makes $25 million a year. And there's people in the league who are making $50 million a year. It's all just relative to who is around you. And that has always been true, that you are just comparing yourself to your peers. Social media makes it a million times more powerful and potent than it's ever been, because now you are comparing yourself not to your neighbors and your coworkers. You're comparing yourself to an algorithm that is so effective at generating FOMO and making you feel inadequate. And every time you open up Instagram, he's wealthier, she's prettier, he's happier, he's more successful. That's all it does. That's like by design what it makes you want to do. Like what's going to get the most attention out of you is FOMO. And when you open up and say like someone is more beautiful than you, someone's more richer than you, someone lives in a better house than you, that's what keeps you scrolling on the device and gets your dopamine flowing. And so it's more potent today than it's ever been to be doing very well, objectively be doing very well, and feel like you're not doing very well at all. I think that is at least one of the elements that's going on today. There's a lot of different elements today. I'm not saying this is the only reason for this, but it is statistically true that the economy is very strong today. The stock market is at an all-time high. Unemployment is near a 50-year low. There's a lot of things where it's like, this is really, really good. And people do not feel it at all. And again, there's a lot of reasons for that. There's many reasons. But at least, I think at least one of the reasons that's playing a part here is that we are now seeing for the first time in modern history what happens when everyone in the world is comparing themselves not to their neighbors, but to the social media algorithm. And no matter how well you're doing, how well off you are, how much your income is rising or your 401k is booming, you feel worse off because 1,000 times a day, you open up your phone and there's someone who is doing better than you, or at least that's the appearance.
So what would you say? What's the solution? Is it just delete the social media apps and start doing meditation?
If you're capable of doing that, then sure. But I mean, I enjoy social media. I don't know if enjoy is a word. I'm maybe addicted to social media, as many people are. But I think it's what's really true. I think this is incredibly important for people to realize is that the view that you get, not just from social media, but even before social media, it is so easy to say, wow, that person's life is amazing. They look so happy. They look so fulfilled. They're so wealthy. And 9 times out of 10, that is a false view of what's going on inside of that person's head. You almost never get to see the down parts of people's lives. People just promote the good parts of their life. They want you to see the good parts, and people tend to hide their skeletons. And it is so common that the person who you are looking up to and saying that person's life looks so great, they're actually dealing with a lot of shit that you don't see and that you would not want to deal with yourself. I think this tends to be very true for the most successful people in the world. The Musks, the Zuckerbergs, the Buffetts, the Gates, those kind of people. The reason they are so successful and so wealthy tends to be that they are mentally tortured. They wake up every morning and have for their entire lives saying, there's a problem that needs to be solved and I haven't solved it yet. And they're driven by a level of anxiety and whatnot. Walter Isaacson, who wrote the biography of Elon Musk, he said, quote, people who are driven by demons get shit done. And that's it. These people who are crazy productive. There's an entrepreneur named Andrew Wilkinson who summarized it. He said, a lot of people who are very successful are just walking anxiety disorders that harvested their anxiety for productivity. They were able to funnel that anxiety into productivity. The flip side of that is it's easy to look at people who are very successful. Oh, look at their house, look at their car. The reason they have that house and their car is because they are walking anxiety disorders that they have harnessed for productivity. And so I think that's one of the realizations is that it's almost never as good as it looks for anybody. And some of the people who are truly happy, who do wake up every day with a smile, are people you not pay much attention to. They live in modest houses and just drive modest cars, but they have a great marriage. They have good relationships with their children. They're in good health. They exercise. That's what's going to make you happy. It tends not to be the things that are visible that we attach themselves to. Beauty, wealth, prestige, cars, homes, clothes, that kind of thing. I think just understanding that and coming to terms with that is a big part of it.
So I agree with you wholeheartedly. The saying of the money doesn't make you happy. But once you've satisfied basic needs, the incremental benefit of it, newer studies come out. It used to be 75,000 and, then that's been raised and it continues to be raised. But it seems like those that don't have money, when they hear that sort of thing, they say, that sounds great, but I kind of want to find out for myself.
One of the things that's come out in behavioral finance that's really important is with the correlation between money and happiness. Does earning more money make you happier? One of the nuances here is if you are already a happy person, then yes, it can. If you are already a depressed person, then no, it won't. Not being clinically depressed, but if you are someone who is just not very satisfied with life, low self-esteem, bad marriage, bad health, whatever it would be, more money's not going to make you happier. That's very clear. If you are someone who, before you were wealthy, you were a happy person. You woke up, you had a good group of friends, you smiled, you laughed, you had fun, then earning money might actually make you happier because you can use that money as leverage to your already happy life. And there's a lot of cases when people who are already unhappy, when they gain more money, they actually become even more depressed, because there's a quote from Will Smith in his biography where he says, when he was poor and depressed, he could dream and say, one day when I have money, I'm going to be happier. And then when he was rich and depressed, then he was just despondent, because he was like, look, I made the money and I'm still unhappy. That realization made him even more unhappy, because he said it took away the hope that he had when he was broke. When you're broke, you can have hope that if you earn more money, things will get better. When you have money, you lose all that hope. And so I think there is a case where people who are already having a bad life, they're already unhappy, and then they make a lot of money. It's actually this depressing realization that there is actually not that much hope for you. You thought money was going to change your problems, and it didn't.
Yeah. While we're talking about different expressions, this idea that money changes people, right? There's some would argue that it does. Others would argue that it just makes you more of who you already are.
I think it's certainly the latter, at least most of the time. And you see this without naming anyone, but you see this in recent years when people become extremely wealthy, the decabillionaires, the centabillionaires, the personalities change profoundly over time. And just to name a couple of people, watch an interview with Jeff Bezos from 1998. Watch an interview with Elon Musk from 2003. Watch an interview from Donald Trump from 1980. They are profoundly different people. And that is not a criticism, because would I be the same person if I stumbled across $100 billion? Like, probably not. There's this great quote from J. Paul Getty, who used to be the richest man in the world. And he said, none of us would be the same person if we could afford to be different. And I might push back and say it's not none of us, but I think most of us would not be the same person if we could afford to be different. Everyone's familiar with the concept of fuck you money, of you have enough money that you can just start telling people off and say, like, I'm not interested in doing that. And I think the takeaway from fuck you money is that the majority of people, once they get to that level of wealth, are happy and proud to start saying fuck you to people. They want to do it. I've often kind of found that that's not the life that I want to live. So I aspire to, like, please, no thank you money. I hope that if I gain some money someday, it doesn't turn me into a jerk. I just want to be like, I think it all just comes back to what kind of life you want to live and what's making you happy. And for me, it is, and I think this is true for most people, this is not unique to me, spending time with my kids, spending time outside, being in good health, sleeping 8 hours a night, trying to help some people, just being true to those things that I think actually do bring legitimate happy to people's lives. And if I can gain some money over time, build up some wealth over time, and use that wealth to benefit those things, if I can use my wealth to spend more time with my kids and take cool trips with my kids, that's an amazing thing. But you have to realize that what's making you happy is not the money or the trips even, it's the spending time with your kids. And when you realize that you can do those things by and large when you have less money, then I think a lot of your goals and targets of where you want to get to change.
Yeah. Typically, for entrepreneurs, if you ask enough why questions, it comes back to they're doing it for reasons of freedom, right? The freedom to spend their time how they want, doing what they want, with who they want. And when you get to a place where someone wants to have a lunch meeting with you, and in the early days of entrepreneurship, it's like, yes, absolutely, sometimes you have to. But then as, let's say you get to a place of wealth where you no longer have to, and you say, well, I'd rather go spend time with my kids, right? So I think that's really what drives a lot of people, at least, the freedom conversation. But I'd love to get your perspective. I know in the book you talk about that getting wealthy and staying wealthy are two completely different skills. And I'd love for you to elaborate on that.
I think getting wealthy requires being an optimist. You have to be optimistic about yourself and your own abilities. You have to be optimistic about the economy. You have to be optimistic about your industry. And staying rich is almost the exact opposite. Staying wealthy requires you to be a little bit paranoid, a little bit conservative, a little bit pessimistic, to have enough buffer in your life to stay rich. And since those are literally opposite skills, you see a lot of people in the world who are very good at getting rich and have no ability to stay rich whatsoever. Or people who are very good at holding on to what little money they have, but they're always going to have only a little bit of money. They have no ability to get rich. And I think those extreme personalities, that black and white personality, that outnumbers people who are equally good at getting and staying rich. And of course, there are people who have done that. There are companies who have done that. There are countries who have done that. But it's a very rare thing. And most of the time people view optimism and pessimism as black and white. Like, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And I think the person who is good at getting rich and staying rich says, well, a little bit of both. The way I describe this with money is, I think the best framework is save your money like a pessimist and invest your money like an optimist. Save with the idea that the world is fragile and I'm imperfect and my industry is flawed and the company that I work for is going to screw up. And there's going to be wars and recessions and pandemics. I need to save my money for that fragile, uncertain future. But then invest your money with the idea that if you can endure all of that, the rewards for those who stick around can be incredible. And so it's always the case that in the business cycle, no matter what the industry is, you see who is just an optimist, because as soon as there's any little dip in the economy, they all go bankrupt. They had no buffer in for bad news, for volatility. And that's why you need to have like one foot in both camp. I'm optimistic in a lot of areas and pessimistic in others. I'm very optimistic in where we're going, and I'm very pessimistic about how hard it's going to be to get there.
Kind of a broader society outlook, because I want to talk about just like financial education. Like, we all know people that make a ton of money and yet are still living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, it puzzled me. I mean, when I met someone who's making $500,000 a year and it's telling me that they're living paycheck to paycheck, right? It doesn't matter where you live in America. I think that's, a sufficient amount of money to at least have a roof over your head. But how does that happen? And is the solution that, we should be paying people more money, or should we be doing that and also teaching people in terms of like how to better manage money?
There's two ways that I framed this. One is that saving and building wealth is the gap between your income and your ego. And so much when you meet someone like that, without knowing their personal situation, when you meet someone who's making $500,000 or $1 million a year and living paycheck to paycheck, I would say the majority of the time, it is because their ego is causing them to live a lifestyle, a grandiose lifestyle that they can't afford. And that is so important to them that they're willing to put themselves into financial jeopardy because they say, I have to be driving this car and living in this house. But also, if you're living in the middle of Kentucky and you have to live a lifestyle where you want everyone in town to be looking at you, look at his car, look at his house, look at his jewelry, you can blow that, just snap your fingers and it's gone. And so most of the time, it has very little to do with where you live or the cost of living, and it has a lot to do with both your ego and your expectations. All like wealth is the gap between your income and your expectations. And if someone is earning $500,000 a year, but they have the expectations to live $1 million lifestyle, it's the easiest thing. It's the easiest math equation in the world to know where that's going to go. And on the flip side of that, you have people who make $50,000 a year, but they are totally happy and content living a $30,000 lifestyle. And those people build tremendous wealth over time. And so that's really what it comes down to. There's also cases where I have no desire to look like a bodybuilder, and thank goodness, because I don't. I'm sure there's people who are absolutely ripped, absolutely shredded, in incredible shape, but they're comparing themselves to something totally different. So much of it is social comparison too. Bernie Madoff is a fascinating example here. The known fraudster. He ran the largest Ponzi scheme of all time, where if you go back to the 1980s, before his Ponzi scheme began, by some accounts, he was earning like $30 million a year from the legitimate side of his business. Not from his fraud, like his real legitimate legal business, he was making $30 million a year. And by all accounts, he was just looking up to people who are making $50 million a year, $100 million a year. And he wanted to get into that circle, those circles. And so no matter how much money you make, even if you are legitimately one of the wealthiest people in America, if you're always looking at the next level up and comparing yourself to that, you will take risks and put yourself in a precarious position to get there, even if like over time, it's going to come to your own detriment.
I know in the book you state that no one is impressed with your possessions as much as you are, because I know we're talking about comparison being the thief of joy, but I'd love for you to elaborate on that and the man in the car paradox. Particularly, I know you shared an experience of you as a valet and parking expensive cars, if you could speak to some of that.
Yeah, so all throughout college, I was a valet at a 5-star hotel in Los Angeles, and it's the coolest job. Like I was 19 parking Lamborghinis and stuff. It was the coolest job in the world. And it dawned on me one day, and I was 19 or 20 at the time, that whenever someone drove in a Ferrari or a Rolls Royce or a Bentley, whatever it would be, never once did I look at the driver and say, wow, look at that guy. He's so cool. I'm so impressed with him. What I would do is I would imagine myself as the driver as that car. And I would imagine myself driving in, and then I would assume that people would look at me and say, well, look at Morgan. He's so cool. He's so, I admire him so much. And then one day I was like, do you see the irony here? I never look at the guy in the car. I picture myself being the guy in the car and assume people are going to look at me. And that was the irony of like, when you are in the car, you think everyone's looking at you. But in reality, they're just imagining themselves being in the car, imagining everyone looking at them. And so that's the idea of nobody is thinking about you as much as you are. They're busy worrying about themselves, thinking about themselves. And that's true not just for homes, but for cars, for clothes, for jewelries. Oftentimes when you see someone wearing clothing that you like, you just imagine yourself wearing. You don't look at the person and say, wow, they're cool, they have those pants. You say, what would I look like if I was wearing those pants? So once you have the idea that no one's thinking about you as much as you are, I think your desire to show off and put up your peacock feathers really diminishes. When you realize you're just like, look, we're basically all in this alone, inside of our own heads. And who I do want to impress in my life are my wife, my kids, my parents, maybe 2 or 3 close friends. Those are people who I really hope they admire and respect and love me. Everyone else is worried about themselves. They're thinking about themselves and their own family. And so when you phrase it like that, it's actually a big relief, because then you can use money not as a way to show off to people who are not even paying attention to you, but as a tool for like, well, what makes me happy and how can I use my money to leverage that in life, rather than this futile exercise of showing off for people who are just not paying attention because they're worried about showing off themselves.
Yeah. I was thinking back as you're sharing this, like, early in my career, there was this car that I thought was such a cool car, like the Audi R8, right? It was like the car like Robert Downey Jr. drives in Iron Man. I thought it was so cool. And I remember going down to the dealership. I remember the lease was so expensive, but I was like, all right, I've worked really hard. Let me pick this thing up. And I remember driving it home to, at the time, like I was showing it off to my immigrant parents. My dad comes outside and says, "You're an idiot. Go take that thing back." But I was like, "No, Dad, I've been working really hard." And the experience I had with this car in the first few months was hilarious, right? I would go pick my wife, who was my fiance at the time, up at the airport, but we couldn't fit any of her luggage inside the car. We wouldn't want to take it to dinner because, just the parking situation was weird. I didn't want to take it to the office because I didn't want to create any sort of like envy. So it ended up sitting in the garage primarily, for months on end, and then eventually got rid of it. And I'm glad I had that experience early on. But, I guess the point of this story is just that, why is it that sometimes we have to experience things ourselves versus just hearing the insights that you're sharing and just saying, okay, you know what, Morgan's right. Maybe I just don't do that.
There's so many analogies here. One of the most profound that I've heard is in the military, where it's very common, particularly during a war. Like if you go back to World War II, that during basic training, you would have all these cadets who are just filled with bravado. And they're like, man, when I get on the front line and I get a German soldier in my sights, like they imagine themselves like the Terminator. And then they get to the front lines and they get shot at, and they are scared shitless. And that is not a criticism, because I would be too. I completely understand that. But the gap between assuming how you might experience in a situation and then actually experience it can be a million miles apart. And it's true for money too, where people who, when they're poor, they dream like, man, when I have $1 million, I'm going to wake up every morning smiling. Everything's going to be great. And then you get there and you're like, nah, probably not, because you're going to wake up and you're still going to have indigestion in the morning. You're still going to bicker with your wife. Your kids are going to have problems at school. The things that actually make your day good, they're still going to be with you and might actually be starker during that situation. So you always have to experience these things firsthand before you know how you're going to react. Very true in investing too, where when things are going well in the stock market, and then you ask someone, you say, hey, if the stock market fell 30%, how would you feel? In that situation, a lot of people say, that would be great. That'd be an opportunity. Stocks would be cheap. I'd buy more. But what actually happens is the reason the market falls 30% is because there's a recession or a pandemic or a war. And in that situation, you feel a lot different. People realize this during like March of 2020, when during like the COVID meltdown, stock market fell 50%. People, by and large, people did not view that as an opportunity. They viewed it as there might not be an economy next week. We all might be dead. Our schools are shutting down. Our businesses are shutting down. Like nobody knows what's going to end. This might be the second Great Depression. And so in the context of actually being in the trenches, feeling that uncertainty, you realize that you have a totally different view than you thought you did when you were just dreaming about what it would feel like.
Yeah. Interesting that you mentioned this, because it's the question of like, how do you prepare for things, whether it's a future economic event or just something that you can't see coming or is often unprecedented. I mean, it's hard to argue that having a plan when it comes to growing money is probably better than having no plan. But, as the Mike Tyson, saying goes, it's like everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So how do you prepare for things like economic events that are either unprecedented or, of course, you just don't see coming?
I think psychologically, well, there's 2 ways to do this, psychologically and financially. Psychologically, if you're a student of history, you know that history is the study of surprises. It's a study of big events that nobody saw coming, that had impacts that nobody could anticipate. That is what history is, which is why when you study history, it's the Great Depression, World War II, COVID, 9/11, these things that nobody or virtually nobody saw coming. And so that should humble your willingness to try to predict what's going to happen next. It's always the case that individually and in the economy, people want to be like, oh, what's going to happen in the next year? What does my career look like over the next 12 months? What does the economy and politics look like over the next 12 months? And if you understand history, you're like, who has any idea whatsoever? To frame this in recent news, Donald Trump last week was shot. And no matter what you think about politics or what you think about him, it is undeniable that we were a quarter of an inch away from living in a very different world than we now do. A quarter of an inch, if that, maybe like millimeters away from him being assassinated and waking up to a very, very different world than it is today. Regardless of what you think about politics, how do you have any confidence in what the economy is going to do over the next decade, what the stock market's going to do next week, or who's going to win the election this fall if on a random Saturday in July, we are 5 millimeters away from a very different world. When you realize how fragile the world is and how much hangs by a thread, it tempers your willingness to be like, okay, here's what's going to happen over the next 5 years. You have no idea. You have no idea whatsoever. Financially, I think the way to deal with things that you can't see coming is you have to have a level of liquidity and conservatism that feels like it's too much. If you are only saving for the risks that you can imagine or for the expenses that you know are coming, then by definition, you are not prepared for the surprise that you can't see coming. So a lot of people, a lot of businesses will be like, okay, we have enough cash and liquidity. Looking forward, we need to build a building next month. Or like an individual is like, oh, I want to buy a new car in the next 12 months. They only save for things that they can foresee. And then when they get hit by a shock, they're completely unprepared. So the level of cash that I think most people should have should feel like it's too much. If it feels like it's excessive, then you at least have a fighting chance to deal with the risks that you cannot even envision. And so when things are going well, when most people look at my personal household asset allocation, they would say, Morgan, you have too much cash. As a percentage of your net worth, you don't need this much cash. And I say, no, that's actually what I want. And they say, well, what are you saving for? And I'm like, I have no idea. I have no idea what I'm saving for. I'm saving for a world in which people are surprised all the time. And so if you can define what you're saving for, then by definition, you are not prepared for the surprise.
Yeah. I think you've given the example before of like even Bill Gates, is one. I think he used to keep like a year's worth of payroll in their checking account. Is that right?
Yeah. When he started Microsoft, he wanted to have enough cash so that he could make 12 months of payroll with no revenue. And even when Microsoft was a $200 billion global behemoth, they kept doing that. He still held that amount. There's a great interview with NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang recently where he said, the unofficial motto of NVIDIA is, we are always 30 days away from going out of business. And of course, they're not even close. But that's the motto. The motto is like, the shit is just around the corner all the time that we need to be prepared for. And when you have that motto, that only the paranoid survive motto, and you mix it with the optimism and ability of Bill Gates or Jensen Huang, you get these incredible results of people who can not only build the future that they want, but they are pessimistic enough to survive all the ups and downs so that they can actually get to that position in the future.
Yeah. I'm curious. I know we talked a lot about just, financial success and building wealth, but how do you define success overall? Like what is success to you, whether financial or otherwise?
To steal the definition from Warren Buffett, he says, true success in life is when the people who you want to love you do love you. And so I've defined this. I said this earlier. My wife, my kids, my parents, 2 or 3 friends, if I have their love and admiration, I would venture to say it doesn't matter how much money that I'm making. If I check those boxes, if those 6 people or whatever love me, I'm all set. The flip side of that is if I'm making $1 billion a year, but my wife doesn't love me, my kids I'm estranged from, my parents are disappointed in me, that's going to be a tough thing. And that sounds kind of philosophical and whatnot, but you actually see a lot of people in this situation to where I did this calculation one time where I said, if you look at the 10 richest men in the world, they have among them a cumulative 15 divorces, and 7 of the 10 have been divorced at least once, which is much higher than the overall population. And it's an interesting thing among a group of people who are so universally admired. And people say like, oh, I would love to be in their shoes. Well, would you? It's, they got some stuff going on in their personal life. As someone who has really admired Warren Buffett for my entire career and just revered the man of how smart and wise and successful he's been, if you read the biography called The Snowball, which is kind of his official biography of his life, you realize that the professional success that is visible to us was at many times in his life masked by these personal pains and failures that had a profound impact on his life. And when you get the full picture of what was going on, you see someone where it's like, yes, I still admire and revere and think he's an extraordinary individual, but would I want to swap lives with him? I don't know. maybe not. And so there's a lot going on there that you can't see behind those walls. So you want to figure out, that back to his definition, success in life is when the people who you want to love you do love you. The other definition that I like, I think this is from Naval Ravikant. He says, the only success in life is getting what you want out of it. And so it's just like, you have to come up with your own goals and your own metrics and your own things and not say, what does society define as success? What does the media define as success? What does my coworkers define as success? What is your definition of success? And if you can get that in your life, that's your own definition. So it's just the idea that it's very individualistic rather than what most people would say is like money, beauty, power, that's success. For some people, that's the case. For a lot of people, it's actually the opposite. They just want a calm, quiet life, hanging out with their friends, and that's their success.
Yeah, agreed. And I guess on the side that you were mentioning, whether it's Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or Warren Buffett, it's like, I guess the world needs these people to some extent. I mean, we all like our iPhones, and we're all very, very much appreciative of Amazon and having that access to Prime shipping and Prime Video and so on. But that being said, I don't believe for any of them, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that money was the primary driver of why they were doing what they were doing.
I think that's almost certainly the case. I think if there's one exception to that, it's probably Buffett, where from an early age, because he's an investor, from an early age, I think money was, of course, profoundly important to him. But I think if you look at, Mark Zuckerberg, for example, Yahoo offered Zuckerberg $1 billion cash in, I think it was 2006, when Zuckerberg owned the majority of the company, and he was like 20 years old at the time. And he said, absolutely not. The personality required to make that decision, and of course, in hindsight, it was one of the best deals to turn down ever. Like, he's so happy that he turned it down. But to be 20 years old and someone says, I'll give you $1 billion cash for this company you started 18 months earlier, and he says no, that is a 1 in a billion personality that exists. And the personality is not being driven by money. I think that is true for Gates, Musk, Bezos, that yes, of course, the money was great, and that's always an incentive, but they were really just they woke up every morning tortured by this. There was a product that needed to be built, and it wasn't built yet, and they had to go build it before anything else was done. You hear the early stories of like Bill Gates back in the 80s and 90s, and I think the statistic is, by his own reckoning, he went 25 years without taking a day off, or something like that, 20 years without taking a day off, where he would literally work 7 days a week. And most of the days he was like, get to the office at 7 a.m, stumble home at midnight, sleep on the couch, and go back to the office the next day at 7 a.m. And he did that for 2 decades straight. That's not driven by money. That is driven by a much higher calling, or just a vision of what you're trying to accomplish. I think it's probably safe to say that in the extreme cases of extreme wealth, it's usually not money that's actually driving that. That's the irony. The people who are not driven by money tend to be some people who actually accumulate most of it.
And I'd love to get your perspective on the advice that people give once they've already made the money versus those that are kind of on the way up and are trying to reach that level of financial success. Because a lot of times you meet people that are extremely financially wealthy, and the advice they give is, follow your passion or just relax and enjoy your life, right? And it seems like to your point, the personality has changed, the perspective has changed, and it's very different from where they are today versus what it took to get them to where they are.
Yeah, I think it was Scott Galloway who said, whenever you find a rich person who says, follow your passion, that rich person probably made their money in like iron or smelting. It's like they made their money in something that was not their passion. And maybe their desire for saying that is because they wish they had followed their passion. But what actually made them money was solving somebody's problem better than anyone else, which may not have been your passion, but it made a lot of money. Chris Rock tells this amazing joke where he says, stop telling kids they can be anything they want to be. He said, that's not how the world works. He says, you can be anything you're good at as long as they're hiring. So that's the good advice. There are some times when your passion is what you're good at and you can make a lot of money doing it. But I think for most people, that's not usually the case. You need to solve somebody's problem and do it in an efficient way, and do it in a way that has a positive gross profit, and do it in there. And that's how you make money over time. I don't look down upon this. I think this is totally fine to make your money doing something that is not your passion, and use the independence that comes from that to fund your passion. You make your money in iron or smelting or whatever it is, and then you become financially independent, and then you become a painter and a gardener and a hiker and whatever it might be from there that actually is your passion. So some people, in rare cases, people are blessed where it all aligns, but I think most of the time it's usually not the case.
Yeah. And I know you're going to be joining us this November at the Game Changer Summit, so very, very honored to have you there. See if you could share briefly, what can people expect?
I like to tell stories about business and life, and they're usually stories that have nothing to do with business or money or investing, but they're stories about behavior, and behaviors that tend to be the same over time. And so I like to tell stories on stage about all kinds of different industries, all kinds of different fields that have a strong takeaway that I hope applies to you no matter what field you're in.
I love it. Well, Morgan, as we come to a close, this being the Game Changing Attorney podcast, what does being a game changer mean to you?
The people who I admire the most in life tend to be the people who you meet and they're very successful. They're very wealthy. They're very happy, and no one has any clue who they are. Not only is their name not recognizable, but the way they live, they look like completely average, ordinary people. But when you dig a little bit below the surface, you're like, wow, you actually live an extraordinary life. I tend to admire those people the most because I feel like those people are doing it just for their own internal scorecard. their success in life is just checking their internal scorecard versus the people who are doing it for the external scorecard of what do other people think of me? Are other people proud of me? Do other people admire me? Are other people looking at me and paying attention to me? I think it's so true that the internal scorecard is going to give you more enduring happiness than the external scorecard. So when you meet someone who is living an extraordinary life, but nobody has any idea, that's the game changer. And to me, that's the role model that I aspire to be or just look up to.
I want to give a huge thank you to Morgan Housel for taking the time to join us on the Game Changing Attorney podcast. If you found this episode valuable, here are 3 free ways that I can help you grow your law firm. Number 1, download the first chapter of my book absolutely free at GameChangingAttorney.com. Number 2, you can shoot me a text at 404-531-7691 and I'll answer any question that you've got for me. And finally, number 3, if you can leave this podcast a 5-star review, it'll help us gain access to more influential thought leaders and bring their lessons learned here to you. For more information on our interview with Morgan Housel and how you can see him live at the 2024 CRISP Game Changers Summit, see the show notes for this episode in your podcast app or visit legalpodcast.com.